This presentation is an introduction into the structures of the brain. There are four main divisions of the adult brain: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the diencephalon. The first three can be seen from the outside of the brain, but the diencephalon is an internal region. So we see the cerebrum, the cerebellum, here's the brainstem, we can even see most of the brainstem here, but the diencephalon is an internal structure. The cerebrum is what we think of as the big part of the brain. It is divided into a right and left hemisphere. Around the outside is a layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex. Remember that gray matter is cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. Some general functions of the cerebrum include providing conscious thought, memory storage and processing, sensory processing, and regulating skeletal muscle contractions. As you can see here, the cerebrum is covered in lots of ridges and valleys. The ridges are called gyri, that's plural, a singular would be one gyrus. It's these ridges here. And then the grooves are called sulci, which is again plural, a singular would be sulcus. There are a few deeper grooves called fissures. The longitudinal fissure is located between the cerebral hemispheres, and the transverse fissure is found between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So here we have lots of ridges or gyri, and then the sulci are in between these smaller valleys here. This is the cerebrum, this is the cerebellum, so this space in between the two is called the transverse fissure. And I'm actually going to go back to the previous slide. This is the longitudinal fissure because it's between the right and the left hemispheres. The diencephalon, that inner region of the brain, includes the thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. Some general functions of the hypothalamus include emotional processing, autonomic function, and hormone production. The thalamus acts as a relay and processing center for most sensory information. The cerebellum, located here at the base, is responsible for coordinating and modulating motor commands. Motor commands begin in the cerebral cortex, but that coordination of motor function takes place in the cerebellum. The brainstem connects the rest of the brain to the spinal cord. It has three parts: the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Another presentation will discuss the functions of each of these regions, but in general, we can say that the pons connects the cerebellum, which would be right here, to the rest of the brainstem. Within the brain are structures called ventricles that contain and circulate cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. There are two lateral ventricles, a third and a fourth ventricle. The lateral ventricles are the structures on the sides that look similar to ram's horns. Each lateral ventricle is connected to the third ventricle through an interventricular foramen, and remember that foramen means hole. Connecting the third and the fourth ventricle is a slender canal right here called the aqueduct of midbrain, or sometimes called the cerebral aqueduct. And I think about Roman times with the aqueducts that they built to carry water. In this case, it's not water, it is cerebrospinal fluid. Much of the right and the left hemispheres are kept separate from each other. However, there are a few areas where information can cross sides. One of these structures is the corpus callosum. In the picture here at the right, you can see how these fibers are crossing from one hemisphere to the other. And in the other image here, we can see it in a cross section. If we were to cut the brain sagittally, it would look like this C-shaped structure here. Another structure we see is the septum pellucidum. This is a tissue that separates the two lateral ventricles. The blue areas on this image are the ventricles. This is the tip of that ram's horn of that lateral ventricle. Here's part of the lateral ventricle, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, and then this is the fourth ventricle. Because the brain is pretty important, there are a few connective tissue layers in place to provide protection. First, the brain is encased in the bone, skull. Then there are the meninges. If you have heard of meningitis, that word means inflammation of the meninges. There are 3 separate layers of meninges: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and pia mater. The dura mater has 2 layers in the brain: the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. The periosteal layer is firmly attached to the bones of the skull, and then there is a space called the dural sinus, and then we have the meningeal layer here. The dural sinus, shown here in blue, is actually part of the circulatory system and drains blood from the brain to return it to the general circulation. It will also serve to drain CSF from the brain. The arachnoid, or arachnoid mater, is named because of the space underneath it, the subarachnoid space, and that's because it looks kind of like a spider web. This is the middle layer of the meninges. Then the very delicate inner layer is called the pia mater, and the pia mater will follow every groove and ridge of the brain. All of those gyri and sulci of the brain will have some pia mater in it. Part of the meningeal layer of the dura mater forms what are called dural folds. I think of them as the seatbelts of the brain, keeping it in place if the head is knocked around. They are the falx cerebri, falx cerebelli, and tentorium cerebelli. The falx cerebri is found in the longitudinal fissure between the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. The falx cerebelli is located between the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum, and the tentorium cerebelli is found in the transverse fissure, that space between the cerebrum and cerebellum. The cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, that is circulated through the ventricles is produced by a special set of blood vessels called the choroid plexus, seen here as the red vessels around the thalamus and anterior to the cerebellum. The CSF functions to deliver nutrients to the nervous tissue of the brain and spinal cord, as well as remove waste from the interstitial fluid. The choroid plexus is constantly making CSF, and only so much can be held within the ventricles, so the same amount needs to be drained out of the ventricles each day. This is done through structures called arachnoid granulations. These are small extensions of the arachnoid membrane that project into the dural sinus. So here we have the dura mater, and here's that arachnoid mater, and then in the subarachnoid space we have some of those arachnoid membranes, and then we have this extension sticking out into the dural sinus, which is the arachnoid granulation. So the CSF drains out of the arachnoid granulations into the bloodstream and then is returned to the general circulation.